Imagine looking up at the night sky, knowing that thousands of miles away, a silent duel is playing out in the dark, not just on the muddy battlefields we see on the news, but in the invisible networks of orbit and the vital pipelines of global energy. Recently, the conflict in Ukraine has taken a dramatic turn. We are seeing sustained, precise long-range strikes targeting Russian natural gas facilities and satellite communications infrastructure. This is not just a tactical shift, it is a fundamental realignment of the conflict's geography. Why these targets, and why now? What happens when a nation under siege decides to blind its opponent's eyes in space and choke its economic lifeline on the ground?
It is a critical question because these strikes represent a transition from localized defense to systemic degradation. By targeting natural gas hubs and satellite ground stations, Ukraine is hitting Russia where it hurts most, its wallet and its nervous system. To understand the gravity of this, we have to look at it through multiple analytical lenses. If we apply a Pestel framework, for instance, the political and economic dimensions are massive. Economically, Russia relies heavily on hydrocarbon revenues to fund its war machine. Politically, disrupting this flow challenges the narrative of Russian domestic stability. On the technological front, targeting satellite capabilities directly impacts battlefield coordination and intelligence gathering. It is a multi-layered assault on Russia's state capacity.
That technological angle is particularly fascinating. When we look at a SWOT analysis of this strategy, the strengths are clear. Ukraine is demonstrating an impressive capability to bypass heavy air defense systems using relatively low-cost long-range drones. This exposes significant weaknesses in Russia's domestic infrastructure security, which was never designed to protect assets thousands of kilometers from the front lines. But what about the threats? Does this risk escalating the conflict beyond manageable borders, or perhaps alienating international partners who are wary of a wider war?
The risk of escalation is always the elephant in the room. But if we look at Ukraine's most analysis, their mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics, the strategic alignment becomes clear. The mission is national survival and the restoration of sovereignty. The objective is to make the war unsustainable for Moscow. The strategy is to asymmetric warfare, and the tactics are these precise strikes. By hitting gas terminals, they disrupt the economic engine. By hitting satellite sites, they disrupt the military brain. This is also reflected in a spear analysis, focusing on security, political, economic, academic, and resource factors. The resource denial aspect here is key. It is about forcing Russia to reallocate its air defense assets away from the front lines to protect deep interior targets.
So, it is a classic shell game. Russia has to decide whether to protect its frontline troops or its multi-billion-dollar gas refineries in the north. That brings us to conflict theory. At its core, this theory suggests that society, or, in this case, international actors, are in a state of perpetual conflict due to competition for limited resources. Here, the resource is not just gas or land, but the strategic initiative. By shifting the conflict from a war of attrition in the Donbass to a war of systemic disruption, Ukraine is challenging the established power dynamics. They are refusing to play by the rules of a larger, resource-rich aggressor.
Exactly. And that power dynamic is deeply tied to asymmetric information theory. In warfare, information is the ultimate currency. Russia has historically held a massive advantage in satellite reconnaissance and electronic warfare. By targeting Russian satellite communication sites, Ukraine is actively trying to reduce this information asymmetry. If you can blind the enemy's sensors or disrupt their command loops, their physical superiority on the ground matters much less. You are essentially leveling the playing field by creating a fog of war that affects them more than it affects you.
It is like fighting a giant by turning off the lights in the room. But how does the giant react? This is where behavioral game theory becomes incredibly useful. Traditional game theory assumes players are rational actors, making calculated decisions. Behavioral game theory, however, factors in human psychology, pride, cognitive biases, and the pressure of public perception. For the Kremlin, losing a gas terminal or a satellite station is not just a material loss, it is a psychological blow. The response might not be a rational, calculated countermove, but rather an emotional, high-risk escalation to signal strength.
That is a very important distinction. Under decision theory, leaders must choose courses of action under conditions of extreme uncertainty. For Ukraine, the decision to strike deep inside Russian territory involves weighing the probability of successfully degrading Russian capabilities against the probability of triggering a devastating counter-response. They are operating under a maximum utility model, trying to maximize their worst-case scenario. If they do nothing, they face slow strangulation. If they strike, they introduce volatility, but they also create opportunities for a breakthrough.
Before we dive deeper into the strategic consequences of these decisions and what the future might hold, let us take a quick moment to talk about what we do here. If you are enjoying this deep dive into global security, you should know that this podcast is brought to you by The New Sentinel. The New Sentinel is a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics. From the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations, we cover it all. Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer listeners a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, featuring expert interviews, detailed analysis, and engaging storytelling. Whether you are a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security, The New Sentinel has something for everyone. Tune in, view, comment, subscribe, and post an inquiry to stay informed and entertained. Now, let us get back to the battlefield.
Welcome back. We were talking about decision theory and the calculated risks of these long-range strikes. When we look at the future progress of this conflict, these strikes on natural gas and satellite infrastructure are likely to accelerate. As Ukraine refines its domestic drone technology, the cost of executing these strikes will continue to drop, while the cost of defense for Russia will rise exponentially.
It seems like a classic war of economic attrition, but fought with high-tech tools. If Russia has to spend millions of dollars on air defense missiles to shoot down drones that cost a fraction of that, the math simply does not work in their favor over the long run. But what about the global implications? If Russian natural gas infrastructure is severely damaged, we are not just talking about a local crisis. We are talking about potential spikes in global energy prices, affecting markets from Europe to Asia.
That is the systemic risk. The international community is interconnected. A strike on a terminal in the Baltic Sea can raise heating bills in Tokyo or Berlin. This is the pestle framework in action again, specifically the environmental and legal aspects. The environmental impact of burning gas facilities is severe, and the legal ramifications of targeting dual-use infrastructure assets that serve both civilian and military purposes are highly debated. But from Ukraine's perspective, these assets are directly funding the missiles landing on their cities.
And what about the satellite sites? Space has always been the ultimate high ground. If satellite ground stations become regular targets, does this signal a shift toward the militarization of space assets?
It absolutely does. We are realizing that the ground segment of space architecture is incredibly vulnerable. You do not need to shoot down a satellite in orbit if you can destroy the command station on the ground. This introduces a new layer of vulnerability for global communications. If these tactics are adopted by other nations in future conflicts, the security of global satellite networks could be severely compromised. It forces us to ask, where does the battlefield end?
It is a sobering thought. The lines between the front line, the domestic home front, and even outer space are blurring. As we look ahead, what should we watch for? Will these strikes force a diplomatic resolution, or will they simply harden the resolve of both sides?
Behavioral game theory suggests that as the stakes rise and the losses become more visible, both players may become more risk-tolerant. Instead of backing down, they might double down. Russia may seek new ways to asymmetric retaliate, perhaps through cyber warfare targeting Western infrastructure, while Ukraine will likely push the envelope of its strike range even further. We are entering a phase of the conflict where the strategic calculations are highly volatile, and the margin for error is razor-thin.
It seems the conflict has evolved from a battle over territory to a battle over systemic viability. The winner may not be the one who gains the most ground, but the one whose critical infrastructure survives the longest. It forces us to reflect on the nature of modern conflict, where a line of code or a cheap drone can disrupt the energy flow of an empire. Thank you for sharing these insights. To our listeners, how do you think these deep strikes will shape the future of global security? Will they shorten the war, or are we witnessing the beginning of a new, more dangerous era of infrastructure warfare? Let us know your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.